They traded her for a sack of flour and a rusted tin of coffee, like she was nothing more than meat. But when a Cherokee tracker spoke her name, the world remembered she was human. The trading post smelled of dry hay, gun oil, and sweat. Flies buzzed near the crates, and dust hung in the air like a waiting breath. Mercy stood still in the doorway of the store, her hands folded in front of her apron, her eyes locked on the cracked leather boots of her stepfather as he haggled with the farmer. "She's strong," her stepfather said, like he was selling a mule. "Doesn't talk much, eats even less. Hell, you'll get more use out of her than I ever did." The man across from him, gray-bearded, thick-bellied, face like a dried riverbed, gave a grunt. He scratched at the peeling skin on his forearm and didn't even look at her. "I don't need her to talk. Just cook, and clean, and keep quiet come night." Mercy didn't flinch. That part of her had dried up a long time ago. Maybe the day her mama died. Maybe the day the stepfather moved in with his oily voice and crooked fingers. She just stood there, chin high but mouth closed, her long braid heavy against her back, her cotton dress too thin for the wind that swept through the trading post. The deal was quick. A sack of flour, 2 crates of salted pork, 1 rusted tin of coffee tossed in like a kindness. Her stepfather chuckled like he'd won something. "Pleasure doing business," he said, spitting into the dust before holding out his hand. The farmer, Emmett Rourke, he'd said earlier, shook it with the kind of grip that made men wince. Then he turned to the wagon, jerked his thumb without words. Mercy moved. She didn't need instructions. She hoisted herself into the wooden cart and sat on the rough plank, clutching her satchel that held nothing but a comb, a threadbare shawl, and her mother's faded Bible. She didn't look at either man, didn't say goodbye. That would have made it real. The horses snorted and kicked at the dirt as Emmett climbed into the seat beside her. He didn't speak, just slapped the reins and started the long ride away from the only place she'd ever known. The wheels groaned beneath them, wooden spokes creaking like bones. No one came running to stop the wagon. No one yelled her name. Her stepfather didn't wave. He just turned back toward the store and started counting tins on a shelf. Mercy didn't cry. There was nothing in her that hadn't already been emptied out, scraped raw by nights without warmth, by words that cut sharper than belts. The prairie rolled by in waves of yellow grass and dry wind, but she didn't see any of it. Just the shape of her life shrinking in the distance, a shape that had never fit anyway. She didn't know where they were going. Emmett hadn't said, and she hadn't asked. It didn't matter. She had been traded. Like grain, like meat, like something useful, but never precious. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white, eyes ahead, and made a quiet promise to herself. If no one else would fight for her, she'd have to find a way to do it alone. The shack looked like it had been dropped from the sky and left to rot where it landed. One window boarded halfway, a door that swung crooked on its hinges, roof patched with tin and hope. Emmett didn't say a word as he led the horse into a lean-to beside it, just pointed at a rusted pump out back and grunted. Mercy stepped down from the wagon, with aching legs and numb fingers, her satchel bumping against her hip like a child no one wanted. Inside, the air smelled of old grease, damp wood, and the kind of loneliness that soaked into walls. One cot, one table, a stove with a cracked pipe, and a pile of blankets in the corner that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. Emmett pointed to the corner. "That's yours," he said, then opened a jar of moonshine and poured it straight down his throat. The days fell into a rhythm that never felt like living. At dawn, she was already at the pump, drawing water so cold it burned. She cooked what little they had: beans, cornbread when the flour stretched, meat when he brought back something from the traps. She swept, washed, sewed up his shirts with shaking hands and fingers blistered from splitting wood. He didn't speak much, just expected. Expected coffee hot, boots mended, food ready, and silence always. When she was too slow, he'd raise his voice. When she dropped something, he'd slam his cup down hard enough to make her jump. But he didn't hit her, not yet. He didn't have to. His anger came quiet, like a wolf circling in the dark. Mercy kept her eyes down, her back straight, and her hands busy. At night she curled up on the straw mattress with the blanket pulled to her chin, listening for the sound of his boots. Always the boots. The way they thumped across the floor like warning bells, each step tightening her breath. Her body grew thinner, her cheeks hollowed, but it wasn't just hunger that carved her out. It was the way he never used her name. Just girl. Just you. The way he looked past her like she was a broom or a chair, a tool that only mattered when it stopped working. Still, she never cried. Crying didn't fix things. Crying only made men angry. She stared out the window most nights, the one that faced the open prairie, watching the moon rise over hills that looked like freedom. She didn't dream of cities or fancy dresses, just the sound of nothing, the kind of silence that didn't come with fear. She wondered if there was anyone out there who still remembered her name, anyone who might have loved her once. But mostly, she wondered if she could remember how to speak without permission. There was a stubbornness in her, buried under the bruises and silence, something small but burning. When she scrubbed the floor on her knees, she whispered words into the cracks, her name, old songs, stories her mother used to tell, just to remind herself that she was still there, somewhere inside the girl who slept on straw and flinched at footsteps. Mercy, that was her name. And some days, it still felt like a promise. The frost clung to the ground that morning like a warning. Mercy had just stoked the fire and stepped outside to draw water when she saw him, a lone figure on horseback, emerging from the mist like something born from the earth itself. He didn't ride fast or loud, just steady, quiet, like the land made room for him. His horse moved without noise, and the man in the saddle sat tall and still, wrapped in a worn coat, long braids tied back with rawhide, eyes sharp as flint. Mercy froze by the pump, hands wrapped around the cold iron handle. The man saw her but didn't speak, didn't leer. Just dipped his head once, slow and respectful, before turning his gaze toward the house. She could feel something shift in the air between them, something that made her skin tighten. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it, something she couldn't name. Emmett came out of the shack, wiping his hands on a stained rag, his face pale for just a moment, when he spotted the rider. Then he forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Asa, thought you were still down near Wichita." The man dismounted in one smooth motion. He was tall, built, lean, like someone carved from wind and muscle, and his boots made no sound on the frost-hardened dirt. He didn't return the greeting, just looked at Emmett long and level. There was history there. Mercy could feel it, but no warmth. "You owe me," the man said simply. His voice was low, steady, the kind that made a person listen even when they didn't want to. Emmett scratched at the back of his neck, eyes darting toward the barn. "I know. You need something tracked?" Asa nodded once. "A boy went missing, south of the ridge. I need the name of the trapper you said passed through here last week." Emmett's tongue flicked over his teeth. "Might remember it. Come in, get warm. Girl, stew still hot?" Mercy nodded and turned back toward the house, her heart knocking hard against her ribs. She didn't like the way Emmett was acting. Too eager, too fake. She set the table, kept her head down, poured stew into the tin bowls. Asa didn't say much. He barely looked at her. But she felt his eyes now and then, not lingering, just seeing. Not the way men usually looked, not sizing up or stripping down, just seeing, like he was noting the bruise at her wrist, the way her shoulders stayed tight, the two small shoes on her feet. It made her feel strange, like someone had opened a window she'd forgotten existed. When Emmett scribbled the name on a scrap of paper and handed it over, Asa took it with a nod. Then he turned to Mercy, just briefly, just one moment, and said thank you. Not loud, not slow, but real. She blinked, stunned. No one had said thank you to her in years. Then he was gone, back into the cold morning, vanishing between the trees without another word. Mercy stood at the door long after, her fingers curled around the edge, the stew cooling behind her. She didn't know what favor Emmett owed that man, but something about Asa, his silence, his steadiness, lingered in the air like smoke. He hadn't looked at her like she was something broken. He'd looked like he was waiting for something to reveal itself. and for the first time in a long time, Mercy wondered what he'd seen. The wind howled across the plains that morning, tugging at the corners of the shack and sending dust into the corners of the windows. Emmett pulled on his coat, grumbling about needing tobacco and shot, said he'd be back by sundown if the roads weren't too muddy. Mercy nodded without meeting his eye, handed him the small list he'd scrawled, and stood back as he mounted the wagon. The horses snorted and kicked at the cold, then the wheels creaked off into the distance, groaning under Emmett's weight and absence. Asa stood near the barn, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. He didn't say anything when Emmett left. He hadn't asked permission to stay behind either. Just leaned against the post with his eyes steady on the horizon, like the land spoke more truth than any man could. Mercy tried to keep busy. She scrubbed the stew pot, patched a tear in her apron, swept the floor even though the dust always came back. She didn't speak, didn't ask if he wanted anything to eat, didn't look his way more than she had to. She didn't know how to act around a man who didn't demand things from her. Near midday she went to fetch water, the bucket cold and stubborn in her grip. The pump creaked as she worked it, the handle biting her palm. Her hands were cracked, knuckles raw from too many winters without gloves. When the bucket was half full, the handle slipped, and the edge of the iron scraped deep across her skin. The water sloshed out as she stumbled back with a sharp hiss, blood already blooming across her hand. She sank to the dirt, clutching it tight, heart hammering, breath catching somewhere between pain and panic. She didn't hear him approach, but when she looked up, Asa was there, crouched beside her. His shadow fell across the pump, blocking the light like a shield. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't scold her for clumsiness or step away like her blood was something dirty. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a strip of clean cloth, and wrapped it gently around her hand. His fingers were steady and warm. She flinched out of habit, but he didn't flinch at all. He moved with the kind of care that doesn't ask for permission, only gives what's needed. She stared at him, confused, unsure how to speak to someone who offered kindness without reason. "Why?" she asked, voice low and shaken. "Why are you kind to me?" He looked at her then, full and quiet, his eyes dark and steady. And when he answered, it was only one word, spoken soft and slow, like a prayer or a promise. Mercy. The way he said it made her breath catch. Not like a command, not like a joke, like it meant something, like she meant something. No one had said her name like that in years. Most had forgotten it, or never cared to know it in the first place. Hearing it now, in that voice, made something shift deep in her chest, something long buried but still alive. She lowered her eyes, not from shame, but from the ache of being seen. He tied the cloth tight, stood slowly, and offered his hand to help her up. She didn't take it, not yet, but she didn't turn away either. When he walked back toward the barn, she stayed there a moment longer, holding her hand to her chest, not because it hurt, but because for the first time in a long time, it felt like hers again. The sky turned dark with clouds before the sun was fully down. Mercy watched from the porch as the wind kicked dust against the fence posts and the first stars blinked behind heavy gray. She stirred the stew, heart ticking in time with every sound from the road. Asa was out near the barn, mending a saddle strap by lantern light, quiet as always, his hands steady even as the world tilted towards something mean. The wagon wheels came first, grinding down the trail like bones in a mill. Then Emmett's voice, slurred, too loud, cursing the cold and the horses and the world in general. Mercy didn't move, just pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and fixed her eyes on the fire. The door burst open with a bang, and Emmett stumbled in, soaked with drink and sweat. His coat was half-buttoned, his beard wet with spit or liquor or both. He dropped the sack of tobacco on the floor and sniffed the air. "Smells like someone's been feeding the dogs too good," he muttered, swaying. Mercy kept stirring. He stepped closer, squinting at her hand. The cloth was stained now, the edges frayed from her, moving too much. His eyes sharpened. "What's that?" he asked, voice low and dangerous. She didn't answer, didn't need to. His lip curled. "You get soft on me, girl?" Let that half-breed touch you?" Still she said nothing. But her silence wasn't the kind that made her small anymore. It was the kind that burned. Emmett moved fast. Too fast for someone so drunk. His hand came up and struck her across the cheek, hard enough to send her stumbling against the table. The stew sloshed. The spoon clattered to the floor, and Mercy caught herself before she fell. She didn't cry out, didn't make a sound. Just braced her hand against the wood and straightened up, cheek red and swelling. That's when Asa stepped through the door. He didn't say a word, didn't shout or growl, just walked in slow, like the room belonged to him now, like the storm had followed him straight through the door. He stopped between them, his back to Mercy, his body still but solid. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, sharp as stone. Emmett's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then he laughed, a mean, ugly sound. "What? You think she's yours now? Think you got rights? She was traded fair. Bag of flour and pork." Asa didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The room went quiet, so quiet Mercy could hear the wood creak beneath their feet, could feel her own breath rising in her chest like smoke. Then Asa spoke, low and sure. "She's not yours." Emmett laughed again, but it came weaker this time. He looked at Asa's hands, the way they didn't shake, looked at his eyes, steady and sharp. And for a flicker of a second, Emmett's drunken bravado slipped. Asa didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The air in the room had changed, heavy and sharp like the moments before a storm breaks. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter. Emmett backed up a step, muttering something under his breath. Then another step. He grabbed his bottle from the table and stumbled toward the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Mercy didn't move. Her cheek throbbed, her hand ached, her legs shook, but she stood. Asa turned, looked at her, not with pity, but with the same awareness he always had, like he was seeing the part of her that still hadn't broken, the part that refused to die. And for the first time, she didn't look away. The morning came quiet and cold, the sky still dark, when Asa saddled his horse with the care of someone preparing for more than just a ride. Mercy watched from the edge of the barn, her breath curling in the air like smoke, her hands tucked deep into her shawl. She didn't ask where he was going. Part of her already knew. Emmett was inside, still snoring when Asa stepped through the door, boots soft on the floorboards. The coals in the stove had burned low, casting long shadows against the wall. Mercy followed behind him, silent, heart pounding. She didn't know what this would cost, only that something was about to shift. Asa stood in the middle of the room, his back straight, shoulders set. He didn't knock, didn't clear his throat. He just said one word, low and steady. "Rourke." The snoring stopped. A cough. Then Emmett's door creaked open and he staggered out, rubbing his face with a hand still stained from last night's stew. "What the hell do you want now?" he grumbled. "Sun ain't even up." Asa didn't flinch. "I'm taking her." Emmett blinked, then let out a dry, rasping laugh. "Taking who? The girl? She ain't yours to take, Tracker. She was traded, fair and square. She's not yours either." Emmett smirked. "Don't matter. I got paper on her, you don't." Asa reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and laid it on the table. The room went still. No theatrics, no threats. Just a pouch and a choice. Inside was a rolled sheet of paper, its edges worn from time and travel. Asa unrolled it carefully, smoothing it flat with one calloused hand. Ink faded but legible. His name, written bold and certain. Tribal identification. Recognition. Proof. "She leaves with my name," Asa said, quiet but firm. "That's more than you ever gave her." Emmett stared at the paper, eyes narrowing. His jaw twitched, hands curling into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. Maybe it was the way Asa stood, unmoving like a tree rooted deep in the earth. Maybe it was the weight of the name, the proof, the truth laid bare on the table between them. Or maybe it was something in Emmett that knew he had already lost. He spit on the floor, lips curling into a sneer. "Fine. Take her. Won't last long out there, not with a redskin." Mercy didn't look at him. Didn't need to. She stepped forward, past the stove, past the blood-stained floorboards and the cot she'd slept on like a stranger in her own skin. She walked to Asa's side and stopped, close enough to feel the warmth of him but not touching. Emmett said nothing more, just turned and poured himself a drink, even though the bottle was nearly empty. Asa didn't speak either. He rolled the paper back up, slipped it into the pouch, and turned for the door. Mercy followed him out into the cold dawn, the air sharp with frost and freedom. The shack behind them faded into silence, its walls holding nothing of value anymore. They didn't speak as they rode away, the sky warming slowly to pale gold. But Mercy kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the reins, and for the first time she didn't feel like something taken. She felt chosen. The wind felt different when it was behind you instead of against you. Mercy held tight to the saddle horn, the horse's rhythm jarring her bones, but she didn't complain. Her legs ached, her hands were raw, but still she didn't ask where they were going. It didn't matter. Every hoofbeat took her further from that shack, from the cold floor, the slammed doors, the silence filled with fear. That was enough. Asa rode ahead, silent as always, his back straight, his long coat trailing dust. He didn't look over his shoulder, didn't explain, didn't ask if she was all right. And still, she didn't feel forgotten. It was a strange thing, this kind of quiet. Not the kind that shuts you out, the kind that makes room. The prairie stretched wide around them, golden in the sun, softening toward orange as the day wore on. A hawk cried overhead, circling something unseen in the grass. Mercy watched the shadows grow long, her fingers stiff around the leather. She hadn't packed anything but her shawl and her comb. She didn't even know if she'd need more. For now, freedom was enough to carry. When the sky began to fade into dusk, Asa pulled his horse toward a river bend where the trees leaned close to the water, and the rocks formed a half-circle shelter. He dismounted and began to unpack without a word. Mercy slid off her own horse slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, but she kept her head high. She wasn't weak, just new to the feeling of being free. Asa built a fire with careful hands, stacking wood like he'd done it 1,000 times. He didn't ask her to help. She did anyway, gathering dry branches and laying them near his feet. He nodded once. That was enough. When the fire crackled to life, he handed her a tin cup of warm broth and sat down across from her. His eyes reflected the flames, but his expression stayed steady. She watched him for a long time before finding the courage to speak. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her, long and slow, then passed her toward the river, where the water moved steady and soft. "Because no one ever should have sold you," he said. Mercy didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever spoken of her like that, as something not for sale, not for trade. She stared into the fire until her eyes burned, and when he stood and spread out a blanket beside the flames, she watched him carefully. He laid it down, then stepped away, making space near the fire but not crowding her. Mercy hesitated, then moved to the blanket, curling into it with her back to the flames. It smelled of smoke and horse and something else, something steady. Asa didn't lie down. He stood a few paces away, arms crossed, his face turned to the stars. He stayed that way as night deepened, unmoving, as if he belonged to the sky more than the earth. Mercy lay with her eyes half open, watching his silhouette against the moonlight, and for the first time in years, she felt safe enough to sleep. The sun hung low as they rode through a stretch of land that smelled of ash and old sorrow. Blackened stalks of corn reached like broken fingers from the dirt, and fences lay twisted in the mud. Mercy covered her mouth with her shawl, the smoke scent still clinging to the ground even though the fire was long gone. Nothing moved, no birds, no cattle. Just the wind, dry and sharp, carrying the memory of what used to be. They passed a farmhouse that had collapsed in on itself, its chimney still standing like a gravestone. Mercy didn't ask what had happened. She could guess. Settlers burning out homesteads, or maybe soldiers trying to smoke out resistance. It didn't matter who started it. The earth never cared about sides. It just bore the wounds. Asa said nothing, but his gaze stayed alert. His hands were loose on the reins, but ready. His horse stepped lightly, like it too remembered fire. By midday, the path narrowed near a river crossing, and that's where they met the soldiers. 4 of them, blue coats, dusty, rifles slung careless but loaded. One leaned against a fallen tree, chewing something that looked like old tobacco. Another spotted Asa first, and straightened, nudging the others. They all turned. Mercy felt their eyes before she saw their faces. The way they looked at her made her skin crawl, curious, amused, mean. The way they looked at Asa was different, tense. Like he wasn't a man, but a threat they didn't understand. One of them stepped forward, tall and blonde with a crooked smile. "Where you headed, Cherokee?" Asa didn't answer right away, just pulled his horse to a stop and let the quiet do the talking. Then he said it, his name, not loud, not slow, just steady. "Asa Blackhorse." The soldier's smile flickered, his eyes narrowing. The name settled in the air like dust after a storm. Mercy didn't understand the full weight of it, not yet, but she saw the shift in their faces. Recognition, hesitation. The blonde one looked him over again, then gave a short nod. "Heard of you. Tracker for the marshals, couple years back." Asa said nothing. The soldier's gaze flicked to Mercy. "She yours?" Mercy opened her mouth, but Asa answered first. "She carries my name." That hung heavier than anything else. The soldiers looked between them. Something ugly passed across the blonde one's face, but he said, "Ain't my business." He stepped aside. The others followed. No one smiled this time. As they rode past, Mercy kept her eyes down, but her heart beat hard, not from fear, but from understanding. His name. It wasn't just something on paper. It was armor, a warning, a door. And he had given it to her. Later, when the sun dipped behind a hill and they stopped to rest, she sat beside the fire and watched him as he sharpened his knife. "They knew you," she said. He nodded. "You're risking something. Giving me your name." Asa looked at her then, not surprised, just steady. "You were worth more than what he paid." Mercy didn't answer. She couldn't. The words stuck somewhere deep. But that night, when she lay down, she curled into the blanket not like a runaway, not like a possession, but like someone beginning to believe she mattered. The river shimmered in the morning sun, wide and slow, its banks lined with tall reeds and soft earth. Mercy's horse stumbled once in the shallows, but caught itself, and Asa reached back, steadying her with one hand before continuing across. On the far side, nestled in a curve of the river like a secret, lay the settlement. It wasn't like the town she knew, no painted storefronts or swinging saloon doors, no church steeple or clanging bell. Just low wooden homes with smoke curling gently from their roofs, neat gardens growing in long rows, children playing barefoot in the dust, their laughter carried by the wind. A group of women stirred pots over an open fire, the smell of corn and herbs drifting toward them like a welcome. Asa rode ahead without speaking, but his presence drew eyes. Some people nodded, their faces warm and calm. Others watched with careful stillness, their gazes drifting to Mercy and pausing there. She kept her chin lifted, her shoulders tight. She felt the questions in their silence, felt them in the way 2 men stopped hammering a fence post to look at her, in the way a girl whispered behind her hand. Mercy had been watched before. Back in the White Towns, it had always come with judgment. Here it felt like something else. Not dislike, not welcome, something between. Asa stopped near a wide circle of trees, the ground worn smooth by footsteps. He dismounted and helped her down, his hand light but firm at her elbow. He said a few words in his language to a tall man nearby, who nodded and walked off. Then he turned to her, his voice soft. "This is home." Mercy didn't know if he meant for himself or now for her too. An older woman stepped out from a nearby house, her hair silver and braided in thick cords that fell past her waist. She wore a cloth over her shoulders, rich with beads and swirling patterns, and her face had the kind of lines that come from more laughter than sorrow. She looked at Asa, then at Mercy, her eyes narrowing in study. Then, without a word, She stepped forward and draped the beaded cloth over Mercy's shoulders. "If he's given you his name," the woman said, her voice deep and steady, "then you are not guest. You are storm come home." Mercy stood frozen, unsure whether to bow or curtsy or speak, but the woman only smiled and touched her cheek gently, then turned and disappeared back into the house. She didn't understand the words, not all of them, but something in her chest loosened, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. They led her to a place by the fire and handed her a bowl of soup, thick and steaming, with soft bread on the side. No one told her to eat, but she did, and her hands, those shaking, careful hands that had never known rest, stilled. For the first time in her life, no one asked what she could do or what she was worth. No one told her to smile or speak or hush. They just let her sit, let her eat, let her be. She looked across the fire and saw Asa watching her, not guarding, not judging, just there. And as she pulled the beaded cloth tighter around her shoulders, Mercy didn't feel bought or borrowed. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she had been brought home. The sky was soft and golden the morning they brought the news. A boy no older than 10, barefoot and breathless, ran from the edge of the settlement to the river clearing, calling for Asa in a voice that cracked with urgency. Asa met him near the trees, kneeling to hear the whisper. The boy's words were fast and scattered, but Mercy caught enough to understand. Someone had come looking. Later, Asa told her the rest. Emmett had returned to town, swearing Mercy had been taken by force. He'd spoken to men with badges, men with guns, men who didn't care much for truth if a lie paid better. Now there was a bounty, her name on a paper, nailed to walls in places she'd never seen. $50 for the girl, more for the man who took her. Mercy sat by the river, the beaded cloth folded in her lap, her fingers working its edge like she could untangle the thoughts in her head. The wind rustled the tall grass, and birds darted low across the water. The world didn't feel any different, but everything had changed. Asa stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes on the current. He didn't pace, didn't push, just waited for her to speak. When she did, her voice was quiet but sure. "If I stay," she said, not looking up, "what happens to you?" He didn't answer right away. Then he moved closer, squatting down beside her so their shoulders nearly touched. His voice was steady, same as always. "I'd go anyway, because I gave you my name." She turned to look at him, and there was no fear in his face, just truth, just the same kind of quiet strength he'd carried since the day they met. He wasn't asking her to run. He wasn't asking her to choose him. He was giving her the choice, to be free, in whatever direction she wanted. Mercy had never been given a choice before. Not when her mother died, not when her stepfather sold her, not when Emmett dragged her to the edge of nowhere and called it home. Her whole life had been hands pulling her from one place to the next, without asking. But Asa was different. He didn't pull, he waited. She reached for his hand, calloused and warm, the same hand that had cleaned her wound, that had never once closed into a fist in her direction. She placed her fingers inside his, slow and certain. "Then I give you my trust," she said. It was the only vow she knew how to make. He didn't smile, not exactly, but something softened in him, like a knot untying. He didn't speak again that night, just stayed beside her, his thumb tracing a circle on her wrist while the stars came out one by one. They didn't know what waited beyond the river. They didn't know who would come first, friend or bounty hunter. But as the fire crackled low and the night wrapped around them, Mercy didn't feel hunted. She felt held, and sometimes that was stronger than safety. The sun hadn't cleared the treetops when they heard the horses. Mercy stood near the edge of the clearing, heart pounding in her throat, eyes fixed on the dust rising from the trail beyond the river. 4 riders. Hard men, dressed in worn leather and lawless confidence, rifles strapped across their backs, pistols heavy at their hips. One of them wore a badge that didn't shine. Another chewed a matchstick with a grin that never touched his eyes. Asa stood beside her, calm as the earth, his hand resting lightly near the knife at his side. He didn't draw, didn't reach for the rifle slung over his shoulder. He just watched as the bounty hunters slowed, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. The men dismounted, boots thudding against the dry soil. "She's coming with us," one of them said, the tallest, with a scar slicing down his jaw like a crooked river. "Wanted. Alive. But we ain't picky." Asa stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "She walks away. No chains." The men laughed, not loud, mean and quiet, the kind of laugh that scraped like gravel. One raised his pistol and fired into the air. A warning. Mercy jumped, the sound splitting the morning in half. Birds screamed from the trees and scattered. The horses pulled at their reins. But Asa didn't flinch. He moved. It happened so fast, Mercy didn't see the blade leave his belt, only saw the man with the pistol drop to his knees, clutching his side with blood blooming through his shirt. Another reached for his gun, but Asa was already there, knocking him flat with the butt of the rifle. The third fired wild, missing both of them, then staggered back when Mercy screamed and ducked behind the nearest tree. She didn't think, just moved. Her hand found the spare pistol Asa had placed near the fire that morning. She'd never fired one before. Her arms trembled as she raised it. The fourth man had his back to her, trying to draw his weapon, mouth open in a shout. She didn't hear the shot, only felt it leave her body like breath in winter. The man spun once, then crumpled like empty cloth. The silence that followed was thick and unreal. 3 men down, one of them moaned, the sound wet and broken. The fourth, a younger one, freckled and pale, looked around, eyes wide. He dropped his weapon, scrambled to his feet, and ran to his horse. No one stopped him. He rode off fast, dust curling in his wake. Mercy stood in the stillness, pistol shaking in her hand. Her breath came in gulps, the world tilting beneath her feet. She stared at the men on the ground, at her fingers, at Asa. He walked over slowly, took the pistol from her hand without a word. His eyes met hers, calm but not cold, and he nodded once. "Now we're even," he said. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. He had given her his name. She had given him her trust. And today, she had stood beside him, not as something to be saved, but as someone who could fight back. They didn't bury the men, just took the horses, their water, and what supplies they could carry. By the time the sun reached the edge of the clearing, they were gone. The fire buried, the path behind them swept clean. But Mercy would never forget the way Asa looked at her that morning. Not with pride, not with surprise, but with something deeper, recognition, like he'd always known it was there, waiting to rise. Spring came slowly, unfolding like a secret across the hills. The river, once swollen with winter melt, ran steady now, its banks lined with wildflowers and soft grass. The trees filled out with green again, and Mercy found herself walking barefoot more often, her feet remembering softness after so much hard earth. She rose with the sun, shoulders no longer stooped from fear but strong from work. She learned to track deer alongside Asa, her steps quiet, eyes sharp. She learned which leaves eased a burn, which roots soothed a fever. She planted corn in neat rows, her hands in the soil beside his. She sat at the fire in the evenings, threading beads in the patterns Asa's mother had once worn, the old woman's voice still echoing in her memory, patient, warm, full of pride. The scar on her cheek stayed, a pale line across the skin. She didn't cover it anymore. It was part of her now, a reminder of who she had been and who she had chosen to become. People in the settlement no longer stared when she passed. Some nodded, some smiled. Children brought her flowers and asked her name. She always answered the same way, Mercy of Asa, not as a belonging, as a truth, as a vow spoken without ceremony. He had never asked her to say it, just as he had never asked for anything. He had offered her his name like a shelter, not a chain, and she had stepped inside it not as something to be hidden, but to be seen. When Asa began to build the house near the bend in the river, she brought him stones, smoothed by time, and stacked them one by one beside him. He carved the beams himself, choosing the wood carefully, shaping it with quiet patience. He built the walls tall and solid, the windows wide enough for light and wind. Mercy wove curtains of cotton and stitched them with lines of blue. They slept under the stars one last time before moving in, side by side beneath a sky too big for words. The house wasn't grand, but it was theirs. The morning they stepped through the door, Mercy saw the carving, at eye level on the doorpost, smoothed into the grain with steady hands, 2 names, hers and his. No dates, no flourish. Just carved letters, deep and true. She ran her fingers over the wood, feeling the ridges, the care behind them. "It's not a debt," he said, standing behind her. "It's a promise." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat full. Seasons turned. She grew into the land like a root that had been waiting for soil. Travelers passed through sometimes, Cherokee cousins, wandering traders, once even a soldier who asked no questions and left with quiet eyes. Word of the stand Asa and Mercy had made drifted through the hills, half legend now. Some called her the girl bought for a bag of flour, but those who knew better said it different. They said she was the woman he paid for with his name, and she gave him her life in return. Sometimes, when Mercy walked by the river, the wind would carry her reflection across the water. She would see herself standing tall, hands calloused, eyes steady, no longer a shadow, no longer afraid. And when Asa joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, they would stand quiet together, saying nothing, because nothing needed saying. Everything they were had already been carved. Sometimes, the smallest act, saying a name, standing still, can change everything. If you believe stories like this matter, please like and subscribe for more.